Uncle Sam FM here, back with my MLS guide to Football Manager 2018. This video I'm going to discuss the MLS Squad and how the MLS Squad is built and designed. MLS obviously very different from leagues around the world. And the truth is that in real life, MLS rules are a moving target. The league is always moving the goalposts on how you acquire players and your squad structure. And so SI have done their best to recreate real life in Football Manager to simulate that. And so I'm going to kind of show you how it sort of works with my personal knowledge of MLS as a fan, and then seeing how SI have tried to recreate that. And for a lot of outsiders, this is the part of MLS that turns them off. They find it as a little too confusing. And so my hope with this video is that it helps you to kind of understand it a little better. So as we look at the MLS Squad Breakdown, there's really the best way to think about an MLS squad or an MLS roster is it's two parts. There are two parts to an MLS roster, or two categories. So your first category is your senior squad. Your senior squad occupies slots 1 through 20 of your roster, right? You have MLS squads, MLS clubs are allowed to have 30 players on the roster or on the squad. And so you break that down to slots 1 through 20, that's your senior squad. Your senior squad are the players who count against your cap. You have a salary cap in Football Manager, and we'll discuss that in a moment. Well, in MLS. And your senior squad are the players who count against that. Right? So the 20 players occupy the senior squad. 10 players can occupy what we call the off-budget squad. This is slots 21 through 30 of your 30-player squad. These players do not count against your salary cap. So you pay them. It's not like they're free. They don't play for your team for the love of the game. But whatever you're paying them does not count against your salary cap. So it kind of helps to have a strong off-budget squad. It helps for depth. It helps you to develop players. But just as just for the breaking it down purposes, these are your two squad categories. So first of all, let's look at your senior squad. As we said, it's the first 20 slots, and these players count against your salary cap. The salary cap, and this is per annual. This is every year. I know a lot of leagues and people around the world are used to seeing salaries or wages per week. But in the United States, for the most part, we look at salaries per year. And so that's kind of how it's broken down in Football Manager and MLS. And that's how I'm going to do it here, just because that's what I'm most familiar with. And the numbers are going to be a little, cleaner this way. So the salary cap, you have $3,850,000 per year. And you've got to keep your salaries below that. Now, there's methods you can use to manipulate your salaries to get it under the salary cap. And we'll probably look at some of those in the third video. But that's your salary cap. And your first 20 slots of your roster or your squad count against that. And so the contract types for your senior squad, the first is your designated players. Right? You get 2 designated players. Every club has 2 designated players. And they actually have an option to buy a third. I think the amount is $150,000 in order to buy a third. So designated players will count against your salary cap, but we'll cover that in a little more detail in a moment, because the whole contract does not count against the salary cap. But these players will count against your cap, as well as senior contract players, and those are your 2 that will occupy your first 20 slots. So you can have 18 senior contracts and 2 DPs, and that's your slots 1 through 20. You may also have to kind of fill out those first 20 slots with what we call senior minimum salary spots, or SMS. If you only have 18 senior contracts and designated player contracts, if your total for those two only has 18, but you've got 4 senior minimum salary contracts on your squad, then 2 of those SMS contracts are going to count in that 20 slots. Now, if you've got 20, if you've got 20 senior contracts, then all of your SMS players will be on your off-budget squad. But if you have to fill some slots out for your senior squad, then the senior minimum salary squad contracts will go towards that. And we'll look at each of those contract types in a moment. All right, so that was your senior squad. Your off-budget squad will occupy slots 21 through 30. And I think this is kind of the easiest way to look at the MLS squad, is you've got slots 1 through 20, and you have the different contract types that fill those slots. And then you have slots 21 through 30 that occupy your off-budget squad and the various contract types that go there. So your off-budget squad is not going to count against your salary cap. So these players will not impact that your salary cap number. So these are guys that if you can get a player on one of these contract types, that is going to help you build your MLS squad. So the contract types that can occupy your off-budget squad are reserve contracts. You can only have no more than 6 of these, and you can actually have no more than 4 non-homegrown reserve players. The idea is the league is trying to motivate teams to develop players more. So they want to make sure that if you have, they want you to sign more homegrown players. So you can have 6 reserve contracts, but at least 2 of those have to be homegrown players. If you don't have any homegrown reserve contracts, then you can only have 4 reserve contracts. And so reserve contracts are your primary off-budget squad. You also have the senior minimum salary players that don't slide into the first 20 slots. So again, if you have 20 contracts that are either senior contracts or DP contracts, then those SMS players can be off budget. So the idea is you want to have you want to fill slots 1 through 20 so that these SMS players can be off budget. Also, any player on a Generation Adidas contract will be off budget. Now, these Generation Adidas players, and we'll cover those, but these are players that you draft out of college, or that you acquire from another team, and no matter what their contract is, it's not going to count against the salary cap. So, Generation Adidas players are desirable to acquire, and the league has made them off-budget players because they want to entice players to sign a Generation Adidas contract, and we'll talk about why that is. The league wants players to either leave college early or skip college altogether, and they do that by offering these Generation Adidas contracts to these college players or these elite youth players in the hopes that they sign this contract and join the league because, hey, clubs are going to want you because you do not count against the salary cap, no matter how much they have to pay you. And so it has kind of helped players leave college earlier. Some turn down the Generation Adidas contract. But in FM terms, it can be beneficial for you to sign a GA player. So that they count on your off-budget squad. So those are your two types of squads. Your 2 types of squad players. You have your senior squad and your off-budget squad. And so understanding that breakdown will kind of help going forward as we look at the specific contract types and when it comes to building your squad. So the first player contract type we'll look at is the DP contract, or the designated player contract. As we said, you have a limit of 2 with an option to buy a third for $150,000. They will count as a senior squad player. You cannot put them on your off-budget squad. Now, this rule was put in. It's still kind of referred to occasionally as the Beckham rule, and the idea was the league wanted to be able to attract high-profile players that they could fit under the salary cap. Because before the DP rule, clubs had a maximum salary. You could not pay a player any more than a certain number, and you're not going to get the best players in the world or even high-profile players unless you're going to pay those guys. And so the league put this rule in to entice these players, right? To give the clubs the ability, if they were willing, to pay a big contract to get players like a David Beckham, like a David Villa, to the league. And so this is, that was the purpose behind this rule. So some teams, though, wanted to be able to find younger players, maybe not high-profile players. And so the league took that into consideration, and they've modified the DP contract rule even further. And so what they've done is they've created 3 types of designated player. And so I'm going to list those here. First of all, it's just the simple designated player. These are guys that are over 24 years old or older. Their salary cap impact will be no more than $480,000. That is the maximum salary for a senior squad player. So you could be paying a player $5 million a year, but their salary is only going to count $480,000 against the cap. If you acquire a player, a designated player, during the July transfer window in the summer, which for MLS, that's mid-season. So if you acquire a player during that mid-season transfer window, then they're only going to count $240,000 against the cap. So obviously, these are the older guys. These are your higher profile guys, like the David Beckhams that you bring in, with the hope that they maybe sell a few jerseys. Obviously, a lot of these guys still have a lot to play. The standard of play in MLS is not as high as it is in other leagues. So a Thierry Henry can still be productive in MLS, even though he's older. And so these are that's the kind of player that this DP is for. The young designated player, there's actually 2 categories of young designated player. There's a 21 to 23-year-old designated player. Their salary cap impact is only $200,000. So this encourages teams to go looking for guys, obviously in their early 20s, who they think are going to develop into great players. And so, again, you can pay these guys $1 million a year, but they're only going to count as $200,000 against the cap. And if you acquire them during the transfer window in July, you get them they count $150,000 against the salary cap. There also is a 20 years old or younger young designated player, and their salary cap impact is $150,000 against the cap. So DPs are obviously, they're a great way to help you build your squad, increase the overall talent level of your team, while also not absolutely devastating your salary cap situation. And so that's one type of senior contract. The other is just simply the senior contract. This is going to make up the largest part of your squad. Now, the most that you can pay a player on a senior contract is $480,000 a year. That is the maximum salary for a senior contract player. Their entire salary count is going to count against the cap. That is, unless you reduce it with general allocation money, which I'll kind of show you how that can work here. As I switch over to the game, and we'll go to a player. Let's find, we'll just say senior player. We'll go Romeo Kyoto. So you can go to Romeo Kyoto's contract, and here you see his salary. His salary is $200,000 per year. You see that right there. And I have $425,000 left of general allocation money. So let's say I'm over the salary cap, and I need to get some players' salaries down below that. Well, if I click here and move that dot over, I can start reducing his salary cap impact. You can go all the way down until it's at 0. So that is, which, by the way, you can do that in real life. So that's a realistic measure that you can take to keep your best players and stay under the salary cap. So that's an interesting and fun way that SI has, mimicked real life. And so your senior contract must occupy the senior squad, or the slots 1 through 20. So those are your squad types. your primary contract types for the senior squad, the 1 through 20s. Senior minimum salary players, their salary is going to be $650,000. That's automatic. If you offer a player an SMS contract, that is the only salary that you can offer, and they either accept it or they reject it. If they reject it, then you're going to have to offer them a senior salary or a DP contract. But if they do accept that SMS contract, then $65,000 will be their salary. So SMS contracts will occupy an off-budget slot, but only if the senior squad has been filled, if it has 20 or more players. And I will have an example, a little bit of kind of an example to look at the end of this video that will sort of show you how a squad might be allocated. If an SMS contract player is on the senior squad, then that entire $65,000 salary is going to count against the cap. All right, so next is the reserve contract. So the reserve contract players must be under 25 years old. So they must be 24 years old or younger. Their salary will be $55,000. Like the SMS salary, this is the only salary amount that you will be able to offer on a reserve contract, and the player will either have to accept it or reject it, at which point you'll have to offer, if they reject it, you'll have to offer them a better contract that's not a reserve contract. Again, you can have no more than 6 reserve contract players, and no more than 4 of those reserve contract players can be homegrown or can be non-homegrown. So if you have 6 reserve contracts, then you must have at least 2 homegrown player reserve contracts. Reserve players will occupy the off-budget squads. That's slots 21 through 30, and they're not going to count against your salary cap, no matter what. All right, the Generation Adidas contract, which we mentioned, this was a way for MLS to entice players to leave college early or to skip college to come directly to MLS, and to kind of give, I guess, a short, brief, perhaps oversimplified history lesson on the Generation Adidas contract. What started happening is you had a lot of younger players choosing to go to college and choosing to forego MLS. That instead of going to the MLS draft, they decided to go to college because, in their view, MLS could not pay them enough money to skip college. They knew they were going to, they wanted that college diploma. The college diploma was more valuable to them than the small contract that MLS was going to offer. From the MLS club perspective, they didn't want to give a bunch of money to a young kid that they didn't know how good they were going to be, because they only had so much money under the salary cap. So a lot of these players were either going to college or they were going overseas. They would rather go play for a Scandinavian club or a lower level club in Holland or so on and so forth, because those clubs could offer more money. Even though they weren't going to start for those clubs or play, at least maybe not right away, it was still a better situation than going to MLS. So Major League Soccer, in response, came up with the idea for Generation Adidas. And all that you really need to know for Football Manager is this will allow a club to pay a Generation Adidas contract to a player. They can give them any salary, and that salary is not going to count against the cap. So every year, MLS offers Generation Adidas contracts to 12 players. The MLS scouts determine who they believe is deserving of a Generation Adidas contract. So in their view, these are the best players. Now, that doesn't always turn out to be true. A lot of times, these guys are busts. Nick Bassanio is a guy that comes to mind. He was a number 1 draft pick. He was a GA, and I think now he's maybe in the 2nd or 3rd division. He never really made it, never really panned out. So that does happen. But the idea is that these are the best players coming out. And so MLS clubs they don't have to be afraid to draft these guys because they can give them the money. And the MLS also guarantees these players money in case their career doesn't pan out. It's kind of like an insurance policy in a way. And so while that doesn't really have much impact in FM, for us, the gamers, you can draft these players, give them a big contract, and as long as they're a GA, they're not going to count against your salary cap, right? So it's it's worth taking a little more of an expensive risk, so you can give a player money without having to worry about it counting against the cap. If it turns out that he's a bust, well, no worries, because for 4 years he is going to not count against your cap. Because after 4 years they graduate from the Generation Adidas status, and at that point their contract will count against the salary cap, whatever that is. So those are your primary contract types. Generation Adidas players will only occupy the off-budget squad. So definitely worth taking a risk on a GA player. So those are your contract types. There also are a couple of player categories that must be considered. First of all, international players. MLS teams start every game with 8 international player slots. And these slots can actually be traded to other MLS teams for any number of years, up to 5, or you can trade for them on a permanent status. So if a club has, we'll say, if you start with 8 international slots, you've only got 7 international players. You can trade one of those slots away for 1 year, for 2 years, for 3 years. Maybe a club is willing to pay you some some allocation money or a draft pick, or you might even be able to get a lot and trade away that slot permanently. So if you are managing an MLS and FM, and you want to sign a lot of international players, then you can trade and try and get access to these international player slots. Obviously, ideally, permanently. But if you've got a player who maybe his contract is expiring, or maybe you've loaned him in, so you really only need that slot for 1 year, you can go and try and acquire a slot for 1 season. For the 3 Canadian teams, which is of course Vancouver Whitecaps, Toronto FC, and Montreal Impact, the Canadian players with Canadian nationality, even if it's their second nationality, do not count as international players. Right? So that's the international player designation. That is important because those help you to build strong clubs, build a strong team. Another player category is our homegrown players. These are players that you signed from your club academy team, which every club in MLS and FM has an academy team. And so you can sign any number of players from your academy. There's no limit to the number of homegrown players that you can sign. Homegrown players can sign any type of contract. They can sign senior contract. They can sign a reserve contract. Most of the time when they're first coming out of the academy, they're going to sign a reserve contract. You can also get them to sign an SMS contract or a senior contract. So if they first come out and they're a reserve, if you're re-signing them, meaning their reserve contract is up, if you give them a senior contract, they're still going to be homegrown players because you signed them from your academy. They were developed from an MLS academy. And so homegrown players can occupy either the senior squad, which is slots 1 through 20, or the off-budget squad, depending on what type of contract you give them. So those are your player categories. And I do have, again, an example of what your MLS squad might look like. Now, this is not what your squad has to look like, but this is what it can look like. So you look at the top, you've got a couple of DPs, and those are international players, right? So they are occupying international slots, some of your 8. And then maybe you've got a young designated player. He's also an international. So he's taking up an international spot. Then maybe you've got 4 players on senior contracts, and they are taking up 4 international slots. Then you've got a few other senior players, and then maybe you've got a senior homegrown player, but you don't have 20 slots occupied by senior or designated player contracts. So that means 2 of your senior minimum salary players are on your senior squad. They're in the slots 1 through 20, so their salaries are counting against the cap. But then you go down to your off-budget squad, and you've got you've got a homegrown player, you've got your 6 reserves, which, by the way, that actually wouldn't work because you've got 5 reserve players that are not homegrown. So let's just assume that one of those other reserve players is homegrown. But so that's kind of how a slot. That's just an example of how your squad might break down in Football Manager. Obviously filling slots 1 through 20 is important. That's how that's where your best players are gonna be. These are your most skilled players. But the off-budget squad is going to be important because these are the players that you're developing, you're looking towards the future with. And these are guys that, because they're not counting against your cap, you can actually take some risks. Obviously they have to be willing to accept a reserve contract. But if you sign a player that turns out to be a bust, it's not as damaging because that player never counted against your salary cap. So that is the MLS squad in Football Manager. I'm going to leave that up there while I close so that maybe you can sort of have a look there at how it breaks down. But there are a lot of moving parts to an MLS squad. It can be confusing if you've only ever known how leagues work around the world. But what I find in Football Manager especially, I find it to be fascinating and a fun way to play because you have to be astute. You have to pay a little attention to detail. It's fun trying to build a winning squad with all of these categories, all of these contract types. To me, it's fun to try and build a winning team, and not just a team that wins MLS. You win MLS or you do well enough, you're going to go. There's continental competitions. You hope to make it to, obviously you're hoping to make it to the Club World Cup where you get to compete against some of the best teams in the world. And so building a team for that purpose it's challenging, but compared to other leagues around the world, but it can be a fun and unique challenge. So obviously I'm biased, but I would highly recommend giving MLS a go in Football Manager. So in the next video, we will be looking at how you actually acquire players in MLS because that also is very different than what you might be used to in Football Manager.